Hey everybody. This is a demonstration for color mixing and for painting that will serve for several of the projects that we do for the color portion of class. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the supplies that we've got here. These are the art supply or the painting supplies that were required for the class. Really the only two things that you need are a brush and your paints, but I'm going to talk about a couple other materials that you might find useful and sort of how to get things set up. A few issues about color mixing because that's going to be the primary sort of technique that we're going to use in order to create our different color schemes and color relationships. So the first painted assignment is going to be due on Monday, November 2nd, and that's sort of like a smaller study of color relationships, which will eventually be used for the final project. The final project I'll describe next week, but for now, let's just talk about some of the basics of painting. So obviously you need your Bristol board. That's what we'll be painting on for the class, same as the other assignments that we've been doing in graphite. You need paints, obviously. This is the set that I recommended, the Basics acrylic set. It comes with 6 colors, so I'm going to talk about these particular colors, but I'll also mention a few other ones that you might have access to. So any acrylic paint set that has at least 6 colors in it will do. Technically, you can do the entire assignment using only 3 colors, just the primary colors of the supposed primaries of red, yellow, and blue. If you watched my video lecture, you know why I'm calling them supposed primary colors. But really any paint set will do. You want them to definitely be acrylic paints. Gouache is too transparent, watercolor is too transparent, oil takes forever to dry, so you'll have to, plus you can't paint oil, you can't use oil paints on paper. So acrylic is the way to go. A few other things that you want to set up, some water obviously. So the good thing about acrylic paint is that it dilutes in water rather than needing like some kind of turpentine or mineral solvent like oil paint does. I like to have 2 containers of water, one to sort of rinse my brush off, and then one to have sort of clean water in it so that I can use that to dilute the paints. And then these colors over here, those are all the ones that are included in the set. I'll talk about those in a second. Things that are useful to have, so you'll need something to mix your paint on. I like using something like this, which is a palette paper. It's sort of like a wax paper. It's got kind of like a waxy coating on one side, and so you can just mix paint right on the palette paper. That's what I'll be using today for the demonstration. You can also just use wax paper if you have that in your kitchen, or honestly, what I usually use when I'm at home is like let me grab one. You can use a white plate to mix colors on, or a plastic white lid from some kind of like a Tupperware container or yogurt container or something like that. You want it to be, whatever you're mixing colors on, you want to be white. So if it's like this palette paper where it's like a little bit transparent, you'd want to place that on top of a white sheet of paper because it's hard to tell what your colors are unless they're on top of something that's white. Okay, so 2 containers of water, our paint, our Bristol board, something to mix the paint on, and then, this is not necessary, but if you have some kind of painter's tape, this is like green frog tape. There's also the classic like blue painter's tape. This is like a 1-inch tape. That's really useful for creating both of the painting assignments because I'll show it to you here. So this is the thing that's up on Blackboard right now, and this is an example of the color relationships chart that you're going to be doing for the first assignment. So this is again for the November 2nd. So obviously, in order to create the sharp edges around your your shapes, this part's all going to be done in boxes. 1-inch boxes, 1 by 1-inch boxes for these 2 bars, 2 by 2-inch boxes for the color harmonies. And just to create the edges, a lot of students like to use, this tape and sort of like, put it down on the paper, then it seals it in and it gives you a nice sharp edge. This student, even though they did a really wonderful job, did not use tape at all, so it's optional. You don't have to use that. So let me just talk about the relationships that we have here and what we're going to be doing with the paint. So as mentioned in the description on Blackboard, this is a chroma scale. This is a tint and shade scale, and then each one of these represent a different color harmony. So we have analogous color over here, complementary colors over here. For these two color harmonies, you can use any color relationship, any color harmony or color scheme, however, whatever you want to call it, that you'd like, except for monochrome. This is already a monochrome color scale over here because it goes from black to white with a hue in the middle. So we have tints, which is where you add white to a hue, shades where you add black to a hue, and then the hue in the center. So this is monochromatic already. So this has to be one of the other color schemes: analogous, complementary, triadic, split complementary, some relationship of that. If you don't know what I'm talking about here, if the tints and shades, if that doesn't make sense to you, it's because you haven't watched the video lecture yet. So watch the video lecture first and then watch this video, which is sort of more about technique. So all the content, all of the sort of terminology is covered in the lecture. Okay, so in order to create this this project, you're gonna have to do some color mixing. So I have a little chart here that shows some of the relationships. Let me zoom in on this a little bit. Okay, so this shows some of the color relationships, and it's sort of oriented around the idea of doing the chroma scale or the intensity scale. So the idea of the chroma scale is that you take two complementary colors. So in this case, we have like a green and a red. And those go on opposite sides. And what you want to do is sort of add them together in little bits. And what that does is every time you add a complement, so every time you add a little bit of green to your red, or a little bit of orange to your blue, a little bit of yellow to your purple, what it does is it deadens that color. It neutralizes it, it lowers the intensity and the saturation, so it's not quite as bright. And so that's the idea of a chroma scale, is that you start with the pure hue on left and right, and you slowly mix them together until you get in the center what should be a neutral mix. That is kind of, it ends up looking kind of like a brown gray. It's something that, like, if you looked at it, you wouldn't be able to identify what color it is. That's what you should have in the middle. So this is sort of from a demonstration that I did before, where I sort of showed how to mix the colors until you get a hue. So here I started with phthalo green, which is often, if you have a paint set that came with green, it will often come with like a phthalo green. So phthalo green starts off a little bit blue. That's why it's included, because it's actually a really good mixing color, because it's got a bit of green in it, a bit of blue in it, and it's really good for like mixing other shades of green and blue. So phthalo green is a little bit too blue. It's not really a true hue of green. So in order to get that, we slowly mix in yellow until we get a bright green. That is like a true green hue. So that's really what I would start with over in this square. Red, for the most part, whatever red you get in your paint set will be a true red. The basics, the Liquitex Basics set comes with what's called naphthol red. Red light basically just means like a slightly lighter hue, generally a brighter hue. Whatever set you get, you'll probably get either naphthol red or you'll get cadmium red, which is a slightly more expensive, fancier red. Either one of them works fine, and whatever one you have, your red is usually just going to be out of the tube. So red and yellow are usually very, very neutral out of the tube if you have like a neutral mixing red. There are lots of other reds. There's alizarin crimson, there's magenta, there's all kinds of purpley reds, but whatever your true red is that came with your paint set, these ones you can usually just use straight up. So if you're doing purple to yellow as your complementaries, obviously you'll have to mix your purple. But whatever yellow you have, in this case it's a cadmium yellow, that's almost definitely the yellow that you'll get. Sometimes you might get something called primary yellow. That basically just means a kind of cheap knockoff of cadmium yellow. Whatever yellow your set comes with should just be fine right out of the tube. And again, that's true with red as well. Also, just so you know, focus on this. Anytime you get a paint that says sort of like cadmium yellow hue, if it says hue on the end, we're talking about hue in terms of it being a pure color. If it's a little tricky because if it says this on your paint tube, it actually means something a little bit different. Hue in this context means that it's not a real cadmium yellow. It's like a kind of a knockoff of, sorry, zoomed in too far there. So cadmium is actually a toxic compound, and it's quite expensive to mine and put into paints. So the really good, expensive yellow paints have real cadmium in them, which means that you also don't want to get it in your mouth or anything, because it's toxic in high enough quantities. So if it has hue at the end, it means it's mimicking cadmium yellow, but it's using some other pigment in order to create something that looks like cadmium yellow, but doesn't actually have cadmium in it. So if you're worried about contaminating yourself, that's actually a good thing if it's a hue. Okay, so what I had here was sort of like a true red on one side, showing you how to mix a true green on the other, starting with like a bluish green and adding yellow to it until you get the green that you want. That's what goes on either side. And then basically you mix them together. And so the first time I mixed them, it came out a little bit too green. You can see it's a dark green. It's got a lot of red added to it, but it's still too green. So I kept adding red and added red until I got to this, which is like a nice neutral, colorless mix. It maybe looks slightly green in the camera. I'm looking at it through the camera lens. It looks a little bit green in the camera. In real life, it's actually, because cameras tend to try to boost up the saturation of colors, it's really like a kind of like grayish brown that has almost no actual hue to it. Okay, so let's talk about how to actually mix the colors now. So I've got a little palette. You won't be able to see the whole thing. I'll put it down here. All right, I've got a little palette that I mixed. Titanium white is the standard white. That's what you should get. Titanium white is like a white that covers really well. It's very opaque. So when it comes to paint colors, you have to think about opacity versus translucent. So things that are more opaque cover other colors better. Things that are translucent, obviously, you can see through them a little bit more. So titanium white is the standard white paint. It's very opaque, and it covers and mixes with other colors really well. Cadmium yellow, that's probably, you'll either get whatever your paint set is, it'll either have cadmium yellow or a primary yellow in it. Either one's fine. This is the naphthol red. You can kind of see in the camera, it almost looks a little bit orange. For our purposes, that's actually good because we're probably going to be mixing it with other colors to make oranges and things like that. So you'll either get a naphthol red or a cadmium red. Cadmium red is also fairly fairly orange. So they're very warm reds. Reds go from the warm to the cool. On the other side, for a cool red, you have something like an alizarin crimson, which is almost like a purple. Then we've got two greens here. This is phthalo green blue shade. So here's phthalo green blue shade. This, if you still have to buy paints and you're gonna go out and buy something, this is the green that I recommend getting, phthalo green blue shade. It's just the most versatile. You'll see why in a second. The one that the basics set comes with is just straight phthalo green. Either one of them is fine, but I'll show you the differences between them. You can probably see on the chart here, or on my mixing paper here, the blue shade is just a little bit darker, and the regular phthalo green is a little bit greener. Okay, then we've got two blues here. Ultramarine blue, that's the one that came in this set. It's probably what you will get with whatever acrylic set you bought. It's a very commonly used blue. I don't actually like it. It's really great it creates a very true royal blue, and it's good for like skies if you add white to it. But it's a little too cool for me. Cool blue. So I find that if you're just making blues, it's a nice blue, but if you're mixing it with other things, it deadens them really fast. What I like is a phthalo blue. So that's, got this giant jug of it here, phthalo blue green shade. So as you notice, the phthalo blues and greens tend to have a little bit of the other color mixed into them. So it's still very blue, you can see here on the palette, but it's actually closer to a cyan. So let me actually show you a little bit of this. here. So if I just start mixing my colors, throw my brush on the ground there. So this is the brush that if you bought your supplies in the school store here at NTRIP, this is the brush that comes with the Design One set, if you bought the whole set of tools for the class. They also sell this one in the school store, so you might get this. Whatever brush you use, I highly recommend using a medium-sized flat brush. So flat brushes have a flat edge, and they're flat on this dimension. They're really good for mixing, and because we're going to be painting a lot of geometric shapes like boxes, and you'll see in the final project we do a lot of like overlapping geometric shapes. You want something with a flat edge on it. If you end up using like a pointed brush or something with a rounded edge, it's just a lot harder to get straight lines. So with this you can kind of do either. You can do straight lines, you can do a bunch of different shapes. All right, get this out of the way. So I'm just going to add a little bit of water to some of these colors. So acrylic paint gets activated with water. So you always want your brush to be like a little bit wet before you get started. And I just want to show you a couple of the relationships between the colors. So I mentioned ultramarine blue is kind of like a classic blue. It's a very deep, rich, kind of oceany blue. It's a little bit cool. You also want paper towels, I should say, to blot off your brush. So every time you dry it, or every time you rinse your brush, you're going to want to blot it off on a paper towel. And then show you the relationship between that and this is the phthalo blue, green shade. Notice that it's a bit lighter, but it's much closer to what we'd call a cyan. And I mentioned before that when it comes to ink, cyan is what's used in printers because you can actually make a greater degree. You can make many different colors that you can't make with like a true blue that you can make with a more cyan blue. Let me dilute that a little bit just so you can see what I mean. It's like a very light, almost like a sky blue. Okay, so that's the blues. Now, naphthol red, the more we dilute it in water, the more you'll start to see kind of those like pinkish, rosy tones come out of it. So when it's very thick, it looks almost orange, but as you dilute it, it starts to get more red. And then I'll just show you the two greens that we have here. So the phthalo green blue is like almost like a turquoise. Remember from the color wheel, the tertiary colors? This is like close to a teal or, well, actually I shouldn't say that. Yeah, it's close to a teal. Teal is more blue. This is definitely more on the green side, which is more like a teal. It's more green than blue. And then the straight phthalo green by itself, very, very similar. But it's just a little bit more greenish. The yellow I don't really have to show you because it doesn't really change colors no matter how thick or thin it is. So when you're mixing colors, obviously for any of these assignments, you're going to have to mix a color to get the complement, to do the chroma scale, to get your two complementary colors on opposite sides. So you want to make sure that you're mixing enough paint. You can test it by kind of like dabbing and doing like a little mix where the paints are a little bit wetter, just to see what color is going to come out. But you definitely want to, when you decide on a color, you want to mix a pile of it. You want to get a sort of like a big enough amount of it that you don't run out, because it can be really hard to sort of mix a color. Once you've found a color that you've used and you run out of it, it's very hard to match it exactly the same a second time. So if you're going to apply it, like if you're going to use one of your colors, like let's say for one of your complements, you're going to have to use a bunch of it because you have to keep adding those colors to each other to get the value scale. The same thing if you mix a green, you're going to have to keep adding white to it, keep adding black to it. So you want to have enough of that green that you start with that you can do the whole project without having to like remix and match the green, it's annoying. It's just annoying. I'll zoom in a little bit more here. Okay, so in order to get a true green, if you're starting with like a phthalo green, what you want to do is take some of that green, and you generally want to add, should be going the opposite way, you generally want to add the more dominant color to the less dominant color. So if one of your colors is darker or brighter, you want to add that very slowly into the light color. The reason being that if I try to shift this green by adding yellow to it, I'm going to have to keep adding yellow and keep adding yellow because light colors change other colors very slowly. Versus if I start off with a kind of pile of yellow over here, I only have to take a bit of green, a bit of the phthalo green, to get like a nice sort of saturated true green. So that's already right there is something that I would call probably like a true green hue. So this is quite blue. So now when I put this down on the page and I paint it out, you probably thought, oh, that looks pretty green. If I put this, if you look at this by comparison, right, this is a much truer green, and this starts to look very blue by comparison, right? So that's the whole idea of comparative color. Okay, so just to show you, that is like a nice true green color. It's a little bit thin, a little bit washed out because I added water to this. So ideally you just want to mix the paints together without using too much water. Maybe just a little bit. They call it activating the paint, just getting a little bit of water on your brush. I wanted to show you these sort of like watercolor effects. So I'm also trying not to waste too much paint because I want to mix a bunch of it. But whatever color you come up with, like in order to get, in order to get like these solid values, you want to have paint mix that doesn't have too much water in it, and often you also want to do a couple of layers, and you'll notice that it gets more opaque and brighter the more layers that you add. So the other really nice thing about acrylic paint is this is almost dry already. So acrylic paint dries really fast. So when you're doing layering effects, things like that, within about probably less than a minute, that's going to be dry, and I can already go over it. So see how that got just a little bit darker, a little bit more saturated, and now we've got something like a nice true green hue that would be good for, basically for that center. If we're going to use a green hue for our tint and shade scale, that's what we would want to start with. Now, what I would want to do is mix a whole bunch of this, right? So get more yellow, get more green, and mix sort of like a big pile of it. In order to have enough paint, because then when I go to do my value scale, where I'm doing tints and shades, right, I'll add a little bit of white to it at a time, and that'll give me sort of like my next brighter, right, and then I can add a little bit more. That was actually too much, sorry. Add a little bit more white to it. I'm going to do this in large increments so it's easier to see, right? So you see how I'm building towards what will eventually become pure white. So you're going to have to do a little bit of mixing in order to get those right. I didn't actually put black on the page because I think we all know what happens when you add black to things, right? They get darker. So I won't demonstrate the other side, but this is how you basically do the tint and shade scale, right? So like this portion, tints and shades. Make sure you mix up enough of your hue color, your main color, your central color, and then keep adding white. You'll notice that I mentioned that, right, titanium white is very opaque. So I don't know how well you can see it on the video here, but these colors over here are much more opaque. I should have some graphite drawn below them so you can see. This is a little bit transparent. I can still see the texture of the paper through it. This is much more opaque. If I had graphite drawings under here, like a pencil drawing, I would not be able to see it underneath these colors. So the more you add white, the more opaque your paint gets. Okay, so that's basically mixing a true green and also how to create your tints of color. Now let me just show you what I was talking about when it comes to making complementary colors. So let's make an orange real quick. Yeah, we'll do an orange blue complement. So I'm just gonna mix a bit of orange over here. You see, I'm not following my own rules. See what I did there? I grabbed a bunch of red in the beginning, and then I tried to add yellow to it, and nothing happened, right? So that's what happens when you try to add a light color to a dark color, is the dark color will keep being dominant. So yeah, case in point. I'll pretend I did that on purpose just to demonstrate it. So I'm gonna get some more yellow over here. What you really wanna do is add the dominant color, the darker color, slowly to the lighter color. So if I keep mixing this over here, eventually I'll get to something that's a pretty solid orange. Now when you're mixing colors, I'm doing it with my paintbrush. That's not really good technique. I looked all over the lab here and somehow we don't have a palette knife anywhere that I could find. So you don't need a palette knife. You can do it the way that I'm doing it. But a palette knife is one of those kind of flat-edged metal or plastic, looks like a little mini spatula, and you use that to like mix the paint. If you have one, you know, or if you can like buy one at the dollar store or something, you know, it's a good thing to have. They come in handy. If not, you can kind of mix with your brush. You just end up having to clean your brush off a lot more. All right, I want this to be even a little bit lighter. Okay, let's get that's a good orange right there. It's a good hue of orange. All right. And now again, when you're mixing your basic primary, or sorry, your basic complementary colors, you don't ever want to add white or black to them. Don't think like, oh, this is like this orange that I mixed initially is too dark, it's too red, so I should add white to it. White will always dilute the color. So you always, when you're doing like your complementary scale or you're doing your tint and shade scale, you always want your main color to be pure, no black or white added to it. You can play, I don't want to demonstrate all this stuff because this video will last forever, but you can play around with this. Obviously the first thing you should do before you even start your assignment is you know, just experiment a little bit with mixing your paints and getting different colors. And you'll see when you add white to things that it very quickly, you start to lose your, the intensity of your color. So this is a pretty good, solid orange over here. And what I want to show you is, right, how you create this, right, the chroma scale, which in this case would move from orange to blue with a neutralized color in the center. Now, and this is true if you're painting, it's true if you're working in Photoshop and you want to create, you want to add another color that will sort of like detract from the intensity of this one. So the way that you do that is not by adding black. Let's say if you're painting, for instance, and you have an orange object, like you're painting an orange, for instance, like the fruit, and you want to create shadows, a rookie mistake is to try to make shadows by adding black to your orange in order to make a shadow, like a shade. Black deadens things in paintings. You almost never want to use it. If you want to create a shadow for your orange, what you do is take a very little bit, a very tiny bit of blue, like a microscopic amount. I've got like the tiniest bit of blue on my brush there. And watch what happens when I mix that with the orange that I had there. What I get is a slightly darker, slightly more neutralized version of that orange, right? And this orange is actually a little bit transparent. So I'd wait for that to dry and then I'd definitely do a second coat. Most of these colors you're gonna have to do a second coat. And then I can pick up a little bit. And sorry if you can hear that beeping in the background. I'm just waiting for it to be over. Okay, so you're gonna keep adding little bits of blue. I'm adding a lot of blue here just to show you how you get to something that's in the middle, right? So the more blue that I add to the orange, the more that I get this kind of like extremely neutral. It's almost black. It's kind of like a blackish brown. And again, I mentioned in the last video that when you it's not going to be equal amounts of each complementary color that you're going to combine in order to get that neutral, because one of them will always be more dominant in this mix. So if I'm mixing an orange, then the red is more dominant over the yellow because it's darker. If I'm mixing blue and orange, then blue is going to be dominant over the orange because it's darker. So it's going to take less blue. If you're trying to get that middle neutral, you know, almost black color, the blue, you're going to need more orange and less blue to get to that point. So hopefully this is sort of like demonstrating how to do your tints and shades, how to mix some basic colors, and then also how to neutralize the color by adding its complement in slowly in stages until you get to that middle. So, you know, if I was doing the project, right, the project that I keep showing you, that would be step 1 for orange, that would be 2. This would be like 5 or 6, that's sort of like the middle one, so I'd have a bunch more steps right in between. And of course, you're gonna do it, I'm just showing you the colors, you're gonna do it very neatly in these squares. So this is not just a paint control and paint mixing project, it's also a technical and sort of like skill assignment where you're trying to, you know, use your skills and your, you know, rulers and alignment and thinking about the clarity and the cleanness of your design and try to present it in a way that is very neat and clean. Okay, so that's partly what you're being evaluated on. So the very last thing that I want to show you, I think it's the last thing I want to show you, is purple. So purple is an special problem. You'll probably find that unless your paint set came with a purple, it's a really difficult color to mix. You might think, oh, I just take my red and I take some blue and I mix them together and I'll get purple. Now watch what actually happens here if I take red and mix it with, actually, I'm going to use the ultramarine, which is a stronger blue. If I mix red and blue, I almost get black. See that? It's a little bit purple. You can see if I actually dilute it with a little bit of water, you can see a little bit of purple in there. But it's kind of like a reddish, almost like a muddy purple color. It's very difficult to get purple out of straight blue and straight red, which is yet another reason why those aren't truly primary colors. A true primary color would be something closer to a cyan being used as your blue and magenta. Remember I mentioned those are the two when you're actually printing. If anybody's ever bought printer cartridges, if you have a printer that uses like separate colors instead of one big color cartridge, the colors are always yellow, magenta, which is more like a phthalo blue, cyan, which is like a phthalo blue, and magenta. So let me show you magenta. Magenta is a color that usually doesn't come with paint sets, but if you're buying paints separately, you know, if you're not buying them in a set, I highly recommend getting a magenta. It's a really powerful color. You'll see, I kind of saved that for last because it's sort of like my secret color. You'll see that it makes an almost fluorescent, bright pink color. It's kind of halfway in between red and purple, and that's why it's so useful for mixing these colors. So watch what happens. So right, when I mixed blue and red together, I got mud, or I got kind of like a reddish, muddy purple color. Watch what happens when I mix. This magenta is really old. Somebody didn't put the cap on here in the classroom, so it's like kind of gummy, but that's okay, we can still use it. So if I mix some of that magenta color with my, what's basically close to cyan, which is my phthalo blue, look at the purple we get out of that. Isn't that beautiful? All right, so we get like a really nice, rich, that's like a true purple. That's a purple hue. That's something we can work with. So if for my complementaries I was going to do purple and yellow, you know, I'm sorry to say it because your paint set probably didn't come with magenta, but magenta is really the way to go when you're making purples. You can use, you know, whatever blue and red your set came with, because what you'll find is that, you know, this is a really crappy purple, but if I start adding white to it, it will get a little bit better. Let me show you that. You know, it kind of will turn into like a lavender, so I'm going to stay away from the magenta because that's almost like cheating. And I'll go with a little bit more blue, a little bit more red. And, you know, it's never really going to come out the way you want it, but this is at least close to a purple. It's kind of like a really desaturated, you know, lavender, basically. This is much cleaner. So if you have magenta, use it. I mean, look at how nice it even makes the water look nice. All right. Yeah, those are the basics of mixing color. Now, when it comes to your technique, you know, obviously use the, use the flat edged brush. You know, you're going to be creating your colors inside of boxes. So you do want to be, you know, careful with it. So with the flat edge brush, you can kind of go sideways in order to make straight lines and then come down, right? This is sort of like the way to make clean squares. It's kind of drawing them with the flat edges of the brush, and then getting more paint and sort of, then you can fill it in. So be precise, be careful, use tape if you have it available. Turn the paper around as you need to in order to sort of straighten things out. But that's the idea of, you know, being sort of straight and clean with your shapes. Now, I'm going to do there's a whole separate video and lecture for the second part of the assignment. But the first part that's going to be due on Monday, again, is this one. So all of the techniques that I used here, all of the different sort of like mixing strategies, that's what you should think about when you get especially to your color schemes. So you can kind of see how like each of these blues, for example, like it started with this one. You add a little bit more green and a little bit of ultramarine and you get that. Take this and add a little bit of white and you get a tint of that. So these color harmonies are sort of, often they start with one color. So that's the case both here and here. That was it's not a color that came out of a tube, but it was a color that was mixed. And then by adding other elements, either, you know, making it cooler, by adding more blue, making it a tint of it, by adding white, that's sort of where you get this different range of colors that create these different color harmonies. So think of it as an experiment. You know, just to preview what we're going to do in the last part of the class, you're going to be doing, this is a whole separate thing, but it's a painting that involves a guy, really brilliant designer and painter named Josef Albers, and he did a lot of experiments with the illusion of transparency. So this was a project that a student did for the final part of the color assignment. You'll see that. We'll talk about that next week, but just to preview it, there it is. Okay, so I'll then end the video there. If you have any questions, email or request a Zoom. And good luck with your intensity, your chroma scale, your tint and shade scale, and your two color harmonies. All right.